Hello everyone, this is Sally.
And this is Ken, and together we're part of the group Middle of the Road who recorded the song Sacramento, which you're about to hear throughout this documentary.
And you'll be wondering how a Scottish band recorded a song about Sacramento in Italy.
Well, we wondered too because we thought it was quite strange. But anyway, the guy who wrote our very first hit, Larry Stott, he visited Sacramento on many occasions on his way to Mexico.
And he loved the place so much he thought he would write a song about it.
And we love his song as well, I have to say. We love it so much. We finish our concerts with it every time.
Bruce Handley got in touch with me on the internet some months ago asking if we would provide them with the song for your documentary, which we decided we would love to do because your documentary is about trees, about growing trees, and we are very much in favour of that. We had an invitation to come over to your premiere, but unfortunately we have a gig.
Yes, we do. We have a gig in a place called Arendonk, which is in Belgium.
So that's why we're sending you this message. We're really delighted that you're having this show, and we wish you all the very best with the documentary and your tree planting.
And we really do wish we could be there in person instead of standing out here in the freezing cold in Scotland. But anyway, enjoy the documentary. It's fantastic. We've seen it and it's absolutely wonderful. And keep on doing what you're doing because we love it.
One thing that a visitor will notice immediately if they can get a little bit of altitude, a couple stories up in an office building or an apartment building, even on top of one of Sacramento's handful of hills like this one, Poverty Ridge, is that Sacramento from the air looks like a forest with a city jutting out of it.
As you know, this is one of the most beautiful, I think it's the most beautiful state capital in the whole wide world.
Sacramento, center of California state government, an historic city that grew and prospered from the days of the gold rush.
Start with the state capital.
But they tell me you should have seen it 100 years ago. The Valley of the Sacramento.
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 Sacramento. Sacramento.
Sacramento.
Sacramento and capital city.
The city of
As the western terminus for the railroad, Sacramento was one of the most important cities in the United States.
The city of Sacramento is a very old city.
Sacramento's historic past.
It's wonderful to be in Sacramento.
City of trees.
City of trees.
Showcase the trees.
Plant a tree.
City of trees.
Trees are really a way to bring neighborhoods and communities together.
More trees. 5 million trees planted.
I like trees.
So does your average Cocker Spaniel.
It's an amazing story, sure. I think it's one of my favorite stories. It's a story I can really relate to and think about. As the settlers came over the hill, I imagine myself, I'm a skier, so I've come over that hill many, many times, and I've seen the forest in many different ways. And I can't imagine what it would have been like for the settlers to come over and not see any of the trees that are there now. Most of them weren't there, and they've all been planted by people, and I think that that's absolutely incredible.
City of Pines. So how do we go from the City of Pines to the City of Trees? It's real interesting. I know you just got to know, so I'm going to tell you.
Sacramento is at the upper part of a vast region called the Delta, which was largely tule, periodically flooded, full of strings of trees in some areas. Nothing at all like it is now.
The title City of the Plains just came from the fact that we're in the middle of a large river valley.
I do have a vision, certainly out in this area would have been rolling hills, small hills, clay, hardpan, dry grasses in the summer, and magnificent oak trees. If you looked out, in my mind, looking out over this area, the start of the rolling foothills, then into the plain where the river bottom is, you would see, the green you would see would be the oaks. The native valley oaks, the blue oaks, the canyon oaks, the coastal oaks.
The oak trees would largely follow the water.
Yeah. Initially, I think reading the history books, what the first pioneers did is cut down all the oaks. Cut them down for wood for the ships moving back and forth up and down the river, and to clear the land for agriculture.
They provided both shade and food, so they were very much a part of the landscape that was essential to the Nisenan people for their sustenance, for their supplies, for everything about their life.
The Indians of California made greater use of acorns than any other people, bringing their methods for gathering, storing, and processing to a high measure of perfection.
And within a few years of the gold rush, that was all gone. Either had been plowed up for fields or burned up in campfires or sawn up for Sacramento's original supply of lumber. But it became pretty apparent shortly after we had gotten rid of all those original valley oaks that trees were essential for life here just because it gets so darn hot.
One reason I think Sacramento is a city of trees was pretty obvious. It was hot and dry in the summer. What do you want? You want trees to cool things down.
By the mid-1930s, Sacramento had this enormous canopy, in part because in the mid to late 19th century, we had to set up shade trees in order to provide some respite from Sacramento's heat.
Unlike the forests of the East, someone had done this. People planted these trees for us.
That's what's so incredible. Most urban forests in this country were removed for people to move into, right? So when you look on the East Coast, people moved there, they saw these beautiful trees, and they said, oh, great, now we have something to build our houses with. So we're gonna remove those trees. And I love the fact that in Sacramento, that's completely the opposite. People came here and said, there's no way we can live here. So let's start making that forest so that it is so beautiful.
In an era with no air conditioning, the only way to keep cool is by jumping in the river or by finding some shade. And a house doesn't quite do the job. Trees provide passive shade that cools buildings as well as allowing people walking on the sidewalk to stay cooler. It's energy efficient, it's useful, and it was brought here primarily by folks from New England. That's why a lot of Sacramento's early trees are primarily New England varieties, those found in the northeastern United States, because that's what the arborists who came to Sacramento were most familiar with.
So it all started when John Sutter laid out his grid for a city here. And it was hot, and he required a tree to be planted on every lot.
Our street design is very much on the New England pattern, the kind that you find in the northeastern corner of the United States, because a lot of our original settlers from there. So the houses are close set, they're narrow and close together on small lots. But unlike New England, where the houses are right next to each other in solid rows with party walls to share heat, in Sacramento you want to keep things cool. So they're separated with enough space to allow the planting of trees that shade the houses. That helps insulate them, helps keep them cool in the summer months, and then in the winter deciduous trees shed, and so that provides a little more light to heat the homes in winter months.
Well, there is a whole history of trees in Sacramento, and they brought in eucalyptus in the 1870s, I believe, from Australia, and they were thought that to be able to suck the moisture out of the ground and dry out the city as well as to provide shade. So there was quite extensive tree planting in the late 1800s. You know, they planted trees because there were not all that many trees, and the trees that were here were cut down to use as firewood or building structures. But they realized they needed the shade, and they wanted to protect and dry out the city because it was flood prone.
A lot of trees were brought here for their visual properties or because of their perceived utility. Eucalyptus was planted in California prodigiously because it had a strong scent, and a lot of people believe that bad smells cause disease. So, for example, they were planted alongside the Southern Pacific shops. The problem with eucalypts is that they're a real fire hazard, and they tend to go up in flames very quickly, especially if surrounded by industrial machinery, and so they were removed there and a lot of other places because of the risk of fire.
Well, I know the downtown area was planted, I guess in the 1880s with the English elms, and they seem to grow more in a column way than a lot of trees, and they managed to occupy a rather short landscape between the sidewalk and the street.
So the elms were real popular around the turn of the century. And of course they thrived before Dutch elm disease, and now we struggle with that in a big way to keep our old elms alive. A lot of them are approaching 100 years, and they're at the end of their lifespan. 100 and 110 years is getting right close to the end for an elm. We've got a lot of big beauties that are close to the end.
The neighborhood of Oak Park originally had a park in its center just called Oak Park, and that was because of the grove of oaks that was on the farm that was subdivided to make that neighborhood. It was later converted into an electric park, an amusement park called Joyland, and after Joyland burned, that's when it was acquired by the McClatchy family, who provided it to the city of Sacramento on the condition that they rename it McClatchy Park, in part because of their founder's love of trees.
And I think one of my most favorite things when I learned that C.K. McClatchy, he liked to talk about Sacramento as being the Paris of the Pacific. And I always thought, oh, right, it's another thing you want to tell people, hey, I live in the Paris of the Pacific. That's awesome. What a great place to live.
I think it started around 1935. We declared that this city perhaps had more trees per capita, I guess, than Paris. I think that's undisputed at this point.
The McClatchy family, the owners of the Sacramento Bee, took an interest in trees.
He was a huge tree fanatic. And he would put stories about trees, the importance of trees, all in the newspaper all the time. If a big tree died or got killed, he'd have an obituary about that tree.
And then in the early 1900s, there were some pretty massive windstorms that blew over a lot of trees, and many of these were large elm trees, eucalyptus, and that caused a tremendous amount of damage. At the same time, they had been widening the roads and cutting the roots of the trees, which made them more susceptible to toppling.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were at a meeting with the city recently, and you've probably seen this very famous historical photo. It's when many of the elms on one street, I'm not sure what street it was, but came down after a storm. And it's an old photo. It's really mind-blowing because these gigantic trees are all laying on their side. And the urban forester at the city said to me, well, you know why that is? And I said, well, no, I don't really know. He said, because it was just 6 months prior that they laid the street down. So they had cut all of the roots on one side of those trees. That's why they went down. It wasn't that the storm was so horrible, it's that they really ruined those trees' connection to the ground, right? So they couldn't withstand probably very much wind at all.
So really the history of the urban forest is really a response to crisis. And we learn from each mistake that we make.
And it's something that I love to tell people when I talk to people about the Tree Foundation, about what we do and why we do it. I almost always start there, because for most people, it's a huge aha. They just think that trees belong in Sacramento, have been here forever, and will be here forever. And that's a great place to start, because what we're trying to tell people all the time is they may not be here forever.
The DNA of the Sacramento Tree Foundation's beginning is a fascinating story. It all started back, surprisingly to me when I thought about it for a long time, back to 1978, though we weren't formed in 1982. 1978, the voters of California passed Proposition 13, which pretty much froze the upper property tax at 1% across the board.
Good evening. State and local governments in California are now reeling under the impact of Proposition 13.
The effects were immediate. The city budget was cut, if I remember correctly, by about 16%.
Prop 13 was a disaster in terms of the city's tree program.
Park and Recreation took a big cut.
It didn't take long for things to start not looking very well. And then people would say, well, you'd be told on one hand by the county you can't touch it, that's a street tree, but the county said we have no responsibility anymore because we don't have the money, and you had a real black hole going in for a number of years on the street trees.
And the county never had a feel of much responsibility, I think, until the foundation got involved, until Isla, Colin, and others like her on the board pushed them hard.
And Cole was a great supporter. in the unincorporated area, she was very, very helpful.
Well, my history with the Tree Foundation goes back. We had the Tree Task Force, and of course, Isla Collins and Phil Eisenberg were very involved in at the Board of Supervisors in the city, particularly after Prop 13 passed and we wouldn't have funds to fund tree maintenance. So they were very interested in it, and out here we were doing a tree planting on Fair Oaks Boulevard.
But it was probably out on Fair Oaks Boulevard, which we ran an early contest called the Ugly Street Award.
There wasn't a single tree out there. They didn't even have holes in the sidewalk.
And everybody in the community was asked to vote on it. The Sacramento Bee and the Sacramento Union at the time, they publicized it for us. And I think not only the first year, but for the next 3 years, Fair Oaks Boulevard won, out in downtown Carmichael. So we went out and planted all these trees. And again, the media was all over it. We had people from 5 years old to elected officials to grandparents out there, families out there. Fast forward 3 years, the mayor of Sacramento, Phil Eisenberg.
I'm Mayor Phil Eisenberg. Welcome to Sacramento.
The County Board of Supervisors Chair, Isla Collins.
Isla was a member of the Board of Supervisors for, I don't know, a bazillion years, and she was chair when all this started. And she contributed an awful lot of energy, enthusiasm, and muscle to leverage the county staff.
They signed a joint letter, sent it to 300 civic and business and community leaders to come to a meeting in the mid-afternoon at the Sacramento Convention Center. And there they proposed that we, the community, start the Sacramento Tree Foundation as a private nonprofit group.
I had bug trees all the time to Phil, and he could not understand my obsession with tree planting.
Well, for me, it started in Jerusalem, as a matter of fact. I think it was in 1977.
That early?
We were in Jerusalem on a mayor's tour, but we'd heard about the Israeli National Fund. And I kind of reflected on Sacramento, well, you know, like its trees. So we came back, and Isla and I can't remember, but I think she jointly signed a letter with me raising money so Sacramento would make a gift of, I don't know, $3,000 to plant trees in Israel.
Okay.
But out of that came the realization that we didn't have anything in Sacramento. And so by 1981, Isla and I had kind of formed some kind of a meeting to talk about doing something for trees. And I don't think it was any more specific than that.
Phil called me when he got back from Israel, and he said, "Are you still interested in the trees?" I said, "I certainly am."
On a Tuesday afternoon at the convention center, so there was no cost to rent the place. It was after lunch, so everybody had their own lunch.
We were cheap.
They addressed the group and said, Prop 13 is ready to bite us. And this spring, we are going to be starting making deep and severe cuts in our respective budgets in the city and county. And the first budgets that are going to be cut are those without a voice. And right now, our city and county, we don't have a voice for the trees. It was a very compelling message. The group of 150 all said yes. They broke into committees.
I think out of that meeting, we came up with some real leadership.
And so in 1982, I volunteered to serve as executive director, and we kind of we had no money, and we ran everything out of one of my extra bedrooms and my dining room table. And Jane Hagedorn was very involved. She was our first president, and we copied her bylaws, followed what she had done with the Lung Association.
And they said, give us 11 months or 9 months. We're going to create a strategic plan. We're going to incorporate, and we're going to be a nonprofit. Trees are our legacy. They're the signature of Sacramento.
And Sacramento's got a lot of them around, maybe not well thought out, but a lot of them around. And the chance to build something new and different was important, and that led to the foundation.
And we were incorporated on March 7th. We were an amazing group. By that time, we had 40 members on the board of directors. We had bylaws and articles of incorporation. We had a 5-year plan. We were going to plant, amazingly, a tree a day, 400 trees that year, and 400 trees the next year for the next 5 years.
And the first year you planted how many?
Well, the first year we planted our 400, but shortly thereafter we were planting thousands.
We had a lot of fun and persevered. And Ray was our first person we hired to do the tree planting.
Sacramento, I think, has always been recognized as having one of the best urban forests in the United States, in the world. And I think that's because, that just has Ray's fingerprint all over it.
Lived in Sacramento for 18 years, and I love the trees. I love this park because it's got the shade, and the trees make it wonderful to have the nice shady mornings when we're out for a run with the dog.
We call Sacramento the big city compared to Auburn, and I really do. This is a piece of home because there's so many trees everywhere.
Many times for people when you talk to them about Sacramento, right? Transplants, natives, everybody recognizes the tree canopy that is what makes this city special.
So if there's an image that reflects our reputation as the city of trees, it's that aerial view. We're the city in the forest more than the city of trees. The fact that the forest, the urban forest, expands out to this massive city, continues along our riverfronts, which are still pretty wild, even though some of them aren't exactly natural, and continue all the way to the heart of the urban core. We're less than a mile from the Capitol. We're close to the business district, close to freeways, but you still look around and this still strikes the visitor as a tree-lined streetscape that you could have seen 100 years ago, and it didn't look all that much different. 19th century neighborhoods were designed to use passive energy and passive cooling. The tall, skinny houses that you see in the neighborhoods of that era are designed so heat goes upwards using what's called the stack effect and draw natural ventilation from the ground, as well as landscaping to reduce heat impact. Then after World War II, as power gets cheaper and cheaper and more abundant, air conditioning becomes a new invention that changes things radically. That's also a period of Sacramento's greatest horizontal and population expansion after World War II.
Right after World War II, much of Sacramento was populated. I can't remember, but I vaguely have a recollection of a couple of 100,000, 300,000 Modesto ash trees planted with subdivision activity around Sacramento. Somebody said that.
So air conditioning really is what made cities like Sacramento, as well as other hot cities like Phoenix, a place to move to. And trees were still valued for their aesthetic appearance and for their design, but not so much for their cooling properties. They were a little less appreciated then and began to be seen a bit of a nuisance as the landscape started to get flatter and flatter and wider.
I think it's an interesting way to look at it is from the founding of Sacramento in 1849 right up to World War II, trees were an important factor of the way of life, the quality of life, and how we saw ourselves. And when trees had to be taken out, they made the front page of the Sacramento Bee, or the editorial page of the Sacramento Bee, that a tree was being lost. Post-World War II, with the tremendous growth, with the automobile being dominant, air conditioning coming in, technology would be the answer, with electricity being more cheaper and more prevalent, that shade trees were forgotten. In fact, I'd like to share one of my principal aha moments. Well, it was 1956 when when the highest demand for energy in Sacramento switched from wintertime heating to summertime cooling, because of mass number of air conditioners that have been churned on since post-World War II. And we've stayed in that ever since. And I love to ask the question, how many trees do we need to plant? How much increase in tree canopy cover to reverse that back? And can we do that?
And the timeline, it does seem to be that the invention of air conditioning did come into place with the decrease in terms of tree planting. I don't know that I've read anything that really substantiates that further than kind of what we've assumed. But it does then make me kind of fast forward a little bit and think about the Tree Foundation and when we began our Sacramento Shade program in partnership with SMUD, right? And so that was because of Rancho Seco going down and closing it, and this brainstorm of, hey, let's create a phantom power plant.
So the idea of a phantom power plant is really, I think, the idea behind Sac Shade, which is a program that is planting trees that are saving energy that would otherwise be produced by a power plant. If we didn't have the trees, we would need a power plant to produce energy that the trees are saving.
The summer sun heats your house like a Dutch oven. The air conditioning is on full blast, wasting money. What do you do about it? Call SMUD. We'll give you a free tree. Winter is the perfect time to plant, and Sacramento Shade will show you how. In a few years, your free shade tree can save you 25 to 40% on your summer electric bill. Plant your free shade tree now.
So SMUD stands for the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. We are owned by the community and we work for the community. We have wards or districts within SMUD that the people that live there actually vote for their representatives. So we have a board of directors that actually governs how we run our business. We are out in the community all the time. We work and really, really hard to have low rates for everybody. We bring a lot of things into the community because we're part of the community. We live here and we love it here and we want it to be beautiful, hence the trees.
I believe it's a very worthy story of the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, the Sacramento Tree Foundation, and their ratepayers. As most of us recall, it was in the late 80s that there was a people's initiative to put on the ballot to close, for the first time ever, a nuclear power plant in the United States that was up and operating.
Rancho Seco was the major political and economic issue challenging SMUD.
SMUD had a lot of problems at Rancho Seco. It had had problems most of its life. There was the light bulb incident where one shut down the whole thing because of a light bulb falling behind the control panel. There was another one where a switch malfunctioned, and it was the most serious nuclear accident other than 3 Mile Island as far as a shutdown was concerned in our nation because it went down so fast. It could have caused the walls of the containment to become brittle and have a major problem here. In 1979, 3 Mile Island had a partial meltdown.
There has been an accident at 3 Mile Island. All pregnant women and preschool children should evacuate out of a 5-mile radius.
And I was reading about it in the Sacramento Union and the Sacramento Bee, and the article said that Rancho Seco was a twin to 3 Mile Island, a Babcock and Wilcox plant. And when I read that, the hair stood up on the back of my neck.
A lot of people played a very, very strong role, including Martha Ann Blackman, in basically demonstrating to people that there was no future to Rancho Seco and perhaps not to nuclear power.
We cannot see, you or me, where it goes, where it blows. It goes to earth, air, to sea, to you, to me. So I read that poem at that meeting, and that's what got me started on a 10-year journey to shut down the plant, which of course at that time I did not know I would be involved in at all. Though Rancho Seco was envisioned as something good for this community, the public became quite frustrated after accidents that included radioactive steam releases and also regular rate increases. In 1984, 2 Rancho Seco workers were killed by a high-pressure steam which burst from boilers in an explosion fire incident. From 1985 to 1988, a 3-year period of time, there were rate increases of almost 92% due to Rancho Seco's problem. This created a lot of frustration for SMUD customers, and for a brief time it hurt the reputation of Sacramento's only publicly owned utility, which was quite important to our community.
You know, Rancho Seco operated on the average every other day. 50% of the time. So when people ask me why we shut the plant down, I said, well, if you had an employee that working for you and he just only showed up every other day, you'd fire him, wouldn't you? And they said, yeah. And I said, well, that's what we did.
The primary issue for me was not Rancho Seco. It was the survival of SMUD as a democratically owned business. And so I was even willing, although I felt it was highly unlikely that it would occur, that I was willing to support Rancho Seco if it could be demonstrated that it was in the best interests of SMUD and the ratepayers. But it clearly wasn't the case.
people have forgotten PG&E was trying to take over SMUD when I got here.
At the time, there was some thought and some effort on the part of PG&E to begin to consider absorbing SMUD into the PG&E system, or at least taking it over. And that was really a credible threat to SMUD.
So the fight to keep PG&E from taking over was a fight to keep electric rates low and keep public control. But we weren't winning when I got here because SMUD looked worse than PG&E to the people of Sacramento. But when we turned it around, the PG&E program just died. This outfit was hated when I first got here. When I was looking to buy this house, the neighbors next door came over. We were in the yard, and she asked me, she says, well, you're moving to Sacramento. What are you going to do when you get here? And I said, well, I'm going to be the manager of SMUD. And she says, I hate SMUD, and walked off and didn't talk to me anymore. When we got here, the people had already voted to that SMUD could not continue to operate Rancho Seco. Everybody thinks the people voted against nuclear power, but the technical vote was that SMUD couldn't operate the plant. And we had an offer from the Duke Power Company and Electricity de France to take it over, and they were willing to pay Sacramento a bunch of money, but we turned that down.
And in the time it passed, the question was, well, how is SMUD going to make up for the power lost when it's actually closed down in the next year or so? And they went through general manager after general manager within months, or 6 months at the most. Nobody had a clear answer. Quite controversial. And then S. David Freeman came along as general manager, had a long history of working in energy with the President Carter's administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And he said the answer is clear and simple. It's conservation. We're no longer be a utility that grows the demand for energy. We want to be a utility that lowers the demand for energy. Extremely controversial.
And he was a major proponent of what we were calling at the time the conservation power plant, which has kind of taken on a fair amount of cachet these days.
Conservation power plant would essentially be how you save energy so that you don't have to actually use it, right? So if I don't need as much, I don't have to build more.
We were short of power here when Rancho Seco was shut down, and the real question is, how can you keep the lights on? And we bought some power and did some other things, but one of the big things is we cut down the amount that we needed to keep the lights on.
He wasn't here more than, I think, 3 months when we got a call from headquarters over at SMUD saying, Mr. Freeman would like to talk to you. We went over to his headquarters, and my president and I, we went in a 1956 T-Bird convertible in the spring, top down, and I told my board president, I said, Bill, this could be a $100 deal or a $5 million deal. I have no idea what we're going to do over here, what he wants. And the interesting part of this story is to go back just a little bit. The Tree Foundation is about 7 years old, 1989, I guess I'd be 6 years old. And 3 people came to us, Gene Shaw, Kim Mueller, and then they worked with Ida Collin again, the supervisor. And they said, we need to plant 1 million trees next year. We said, you gotta be kidding.
We were standing in my tiny kitchen near the refrigerator. There was a to-do list on the fridge, and Jeannie at one point picked up the pen that was next to the list and just wrote on the list, plant 1 million trees by the year 2000.
Then City Councilwoman Kim Mueller had a few of us over to envision our dreams for Sacramento for the new millennium. And I wrote on her refrigerator to plant 1 million trees in Sacramento.
And I would say that idea really is when the seed got planted, certainly in my mind.
And the board kind of looked inward to itself and asked us what we were doing at the time. We were 6 years old. We still had only part-time staff, no benefits. We still worked out of the back room of the volunteer executive director's home.
We reached out, I believe, to Isla Collin on the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors, a known supporter of environmental issues and lover of trees. Working with my amazing administrative assistant, Rosanna Herber, we ultimately formed a committee that we called Trees for Tomorrow.
Trees for Tomorrow, which the Sacramento Tree Foundation embraced as a campaign to plant 1 million trees.
And it brought together a coalition of folks, including, of course, the Sacramento Tree Foundation, but also city departments, county departments, I do believe builders and folks who represented all aspects of the community, Chamber of Commerce.
Well, not too long after that, you somehow, Ray, some of the others got SMUD involved in the program. And they were initially skeptical about it, is my recollection.
Well, remember Dave Foreman, though?
Yeah.
He had the vision, too. Yeah.
Okay. Well, David came in, he had a lot of visions.
Yeah,
but,
right, he did.
But that was probably, in my judgment, the biggest leap in terms of expanding the scope of the foundation.
Now, the interesting story about this is that 2 months before he called us, maybe a month before he called us, he was at Jean Shaw's house with dinner with Lloyd Connolly, her husband.
But I understand that there was a special dinner that he was invited to with a number of the board members, in which he wore his special 10-gallon hat, where they were talking about this very idea of conserving our way to solutions instead of building our way there.
And Lloyd and David talk a lot. And Jean couldn't get a word in edgewise. And by the time the evening was over and it was late, David was ready to go drive home, which he did, but S. David Freeman always wore a 10-gallon hat.
Well, I'm all hat and no cows.
And that there was an accidental hat left at the party that night, and he had to come back and pick it up at the board member's house the next day.
A white 10-gallon hat. And she purposely took that hat and hid it. So when he went home that night, he didn't have his hat to go to work the next morning. And Jean was waiting for the call. It's here, David. You didn't lose on the sidewalk. It's here. And so he came back to get it.
And it was her opportunity to further the conversation with him, to let him know that absolutely trees should be in the future of SMUD.
You want to win back the goodwill of the people of Sacramento. Because SMUD right now is like way down the popularity list. I mean, it's off the chart, it's down. People are so frustrated with them, they couldn't get their act together. There wasn't an answer to closing the power plant. And she was the one that planted the seed.
When I moved into this house, I noticed that I didn't need to run the air conditioner because I had this big tree shading the house. And it occurred to me that, and I made up this little poem. It went like this. It said, I think that I will never see an air conditioner as lovely as a tree. And that kind of made a general manager that was a little bit funny. That was a little unusual. And I said, well, we're gonna make the trees an efficiency measure, just like a more efficient air conditioner or just like a more efficient refrigerator or just like insulation in the building. Let's think of the tree as an efficiency measure.
When you think of trees in the landscape as kind of mini air conditioners because they're shading buildings, like people sweat to cool off their skin, a tree transpires and it cools off its surface by evaporating moisture and from the leaves. So that lowers the air temperature. So as a function of both shade and this evapotranspirational cooling, trees reduce the air conditioning load on homes. And in the Sacramento region, that comes up to about 100 kilowatt hours a year that's saved by a well-positioned tree.
But that means we can't just plant them willy-nilly anywhere. We've got to figure out how to get homeowners to plant them in the right place. And I said, do we have any resources that we could put to work to do that. And they said, no, but there's a tree foundation here. I said, well, thank God. Let's find out. And so we sat down with them and we found out that that's exactly the kind of organization that we would have had to organize if it didn't exist.
So it takes 1,000 days to plant a tree here. We have a very dry climate. It doesn't rain in late spring, it doesn't rain at all during the summer, it doesn't rain in early fall. Trees don't survive unless they have 3 years of care.
And so we contracted with the Tree Foundation so that we not only planted trees, but we planted them in the right place and taught people how to take care of them so that they would grow. I mean, you know, you can get in an airplane and throw out twigs and plant 1 million trees in an hour and claim you've done nothing. But we focused on getting trees that would actually mature and become air conditioners.
And we finally came up with a plan to plant 1 million trees. It was a very simple plan. We would increase by that, we're not planting 400 trees a year, we're planting 1,000 trees a year. So we're going to increase our commitment to 10,000 a year, and we get the community to plant 90,000 a year, and do the math, and you get 1 million trees.
It helped that there was a community group and the Tree Foundation planting every year. We said, we will plant street trees now. We will plant anywhere there needs to be a street tree. Right. With free trees from SMUD, help and skill of the Tree Foundation, and volunteers.
This community, they lined up for the trees. We never had to market anything, not a word. It was all word of mouth. And we had neighborhood plantings of 100 trees, 300 trees. People would go to a church parking lot, a school parking lot, a neighborhood cul-de-sac, a community center. And we'd bring out maybe 100, 200 trees, have a planting demonstration, distribute the trees out, and then stay in the neighborhood to help people get the trees planted correctly. And it was very, very exciting times. But a fascinating thing happened. While we were celebrating and high-fiving over here at the Sacramento Tree Foundation, a small nonprofit, saying, we nailed it. We got those trees in the ground. We're going for the next 475,000 trees. SMUD's over there pulling their hair out. What does this nonprofit think they are? They have no inventory. They have no human resource department. They have very little checks and balances, you know. They're just out there planting trees. We want them to be here for 10 more years. And so they could have left us right there saying, we're not ready for this kind of big, bold initiatives and stability. But instead, they actually hired an outside consultant to do an organizational assessment of us. And then we really began to grow as a complete and full nonprofit that could handle the growth as well as the diversity of projects that we do today. That's because of the tolerance as well as the faith in us that was demonstrated by S. David Freeman.
And so I often think about that hat and that man and what would have been if it wasn't him sitting in the seat at SMUD at that time.
Dave Freeman really was the person who virtually single-handedly transformed SMUD into an organization that was supported by the people of Sacramento and who gave hope that the decision that they made was the proper one.
It wasn't cheap because it takes a lot of resources to, you know, the tree itself is the cheapest part of it. I mean, we had some free labor from the people that got the free tree, but we had to have experts to help shape it and all and get trees that had a good start. And so the cost per tree was not small. And one day, one of the board members thought he was being smart. He started attacking the program, and he started arguing with me and telling me that you could do it a whole lot cheaper. And I said, well, you know, you're comparing oranges with watermelons. And everybody started laughing, and they just didn't pay attention to him because it was a popular program. And I think of all the things that we started at SMUD back in the early 90s, it may be the longest lasting program that they've had and perhaps maybe the most important.
So SMUD's part of the partnership with the Sacramento Tree Foundation is really to get the word out. We have a marketing budget and we reach out to our customers a number of different ways, through our bill package, online, through web. We reach over 500,000 customers a year that participate. Each customer is available to get trees every 3 years. They can get up to 10 trees per yard.
This program is now it's over 25 years old. Far, in a way, it's the most acclaimed energy, nonprofit, community tree planting program in the world. Over 500,000 trees have been put out, and over 200,000 SMUD customers have benefited from this incredible service.
The program is one of our oldest programs. It's 27 years old. It was started in 1990. Since its inception, we've planted close to 600,000 shade trees here in the Sacramento area.
The Sacramento Shade Program is the nation's oldest, largest, and most successful energy-saving shade tree program in the nation.
I understand, due to the Tree Foundation's good record keeping, that it was exactly 28 years ago today. We're here on April 29th, 2017. April 29th, 1989, this tree behind me was planted at Peter Burnett School as the first tree, the official first tree of that million. There are 2 other trees on the other side of me. I am just so elated to come back here all these years later and to see these trees still here and thriving and providing amazing shade.
On the first Arbor Day of the new millennium, the Sacramento Tree Foundation planted this tree, representing the millionth tree in our campaign to make the best urban forest in Sacramento.
It's because of them, really, that the Tree Foundation is here today and that millions of trees that are in the ground are here.
You know, things start little, get bigger, and that's probably the important message of the Tree Foundation.
We found the essence of the urban forest, which was people and stewardship. Stewardship and people. People need trees, people need tree canopy. The tree canopy needs people to steward them.
From 1990 through 2001, the Sacramento Tree Foundation partnered with SMUD to lead the Trees for Tomorrow campaign, which resulted in 1 million more trees planted here in Sacramento.
It really is a living legacy that was envisioned and led by SMUD. We're most appreciative.
Well, SMUD's really excited to have been your partner for almost 30 years now. We look forward to the future, and as I understand it, there's room for 5 million more trees, so let's go take a look.
There's a lot more room. There are some neighborhoods out here that don't have much canopy at all. We want you to join us. Let's go take a look. Let's make a difference.
You don't know until this other feeling here inside you starts to grow. You're in Sacramento, a wonderful town. Sing, 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 din, din, din. Now that spring is near again, and you're thinking if only you were not so lonely. Ooh, but you can ease your restless mind. 'Cause all the people are loving kind in Sacramento. you don't know.